We're starting really late here. But slide over to Joshua chapter 6 so we can pick up where we'll be at. We're working through the book of Joshua. We want to try to finish it next week, and it's broken down into 3 sections. Last week we dealt with the first 5 chapters in section 1, which deals with how Israel claimed its possessions and prepared themselves and what all they did to get ready to go into the promised land. Part 2 comes in starting at chapter 6 through chapter 12, and it deals with subjection of the land, or it deals with Israel conquering the possessions. Now, for those with your little outline, you see the little map outline in the top of your right-hand side, number 2, where it says Israel conquers. Note that them arrows, because this is what happens in chapters 6 through 12. We're not going to look at all the chapters, all the verses and stuff, but if you notice in each of your outlines, there's like a couple statements written under each portion, like under phase 3, there's 2, under phase 1, there's 4, under phase 2, there's 3. We're going to focus on them because they really highlight the whole book, and I would encourage any and all people to go through Joshua and go through it slowly and really pay attention to what's being said, because Joshua is to the Hebrews what the book of Acts is to the church. Joshua is where they were founded and really began as a nation. Now, they were a nation before that, but this is where they're really getting into their place. And this is their history. Just like the book of Acts is about the history of the church in its formation and up for a few years down the road. Now, one of the things that I like about, let me do it that way. One of the things that I like about this beginning of to conquer the land is the way they do it. It's broken into 3 campaigns. Campaign number 1 is called the Central Campaign, and we'll be looking at that in a minute. Campaign number 2 is the Southern Campaign. Campaign number 3 is the Northern Campaign. Now, I don't know why they did it this way. I don't know why they were led or told to attack the middle of the country first, then to go south, and then after they had done the south, to travel all the way up to the north. I'm not sure why they did it that way, but I know that they have some serious problems. And remember, this passage, this part here from chapter 6 through chapter 12, this is about a 15-year period, because that's about how long it took them to do all this. The whole book's about 25 years, but this is about a 15-year period. So we want to look at the Central Campaign, which is covered from Joshua chapter 6 through chapter 8. We know a good part of these parts because we know these stories about the city of Jericho. Now, I read something years ago by a man that made a statement about this activity of God here. What did God tell the Israelites to do concerning Jericho? Before they even started around it, what did God tell them they had to do? Does anybody know offhand?
Before they went to Jericho?
Before they took it. What did God tell them to do in preparation of before they took the wall, took the city? I know you know it, and all of you are going to say, "Oh, I wasn't thinking that way." He told them they had to walk around the city 1 time every day, and on the 7th day, 7 times. Now, 2 things. One, I can agree with very easily. The second one, I'm not certain of, and I don't know why I know this, but somewhere I had came across information that said that it would probably have taken about an hour and a half to walk around the city mount, on the outside. But what I found interesting in a writing years ago was how a man spoke of this time as psychological warfare and the effects it must have had on these people. Because think about this. Jericho is the largest city they're going to deal with the whole time. got the most people, the strongest army that they're going to deal with the whole time. Israel sends, I think it's a total of 40,000 it's 40,000 they send on this ordeal of walking around. Now, several things got to me on this, and particularly in the psychological part, because we know that before they started walking around, we know that they knew about God. They knew what God had done. Now they're watching these same people that God brought through the Red Sea. They're watching them same people walk around their wall without saying a word. They're not allowed to make a sound. I'd like to know what was going through the minds of those guys on the wall. And I've often wondered, why didn't the archers, at least, start shooting them? These people were paralyzed by something. And I believe it was the fear of God that they had received when they heard about what God had done for the Israelites, bringing them out of Egypt. But they walk around the times, 6 days, once a day, 7 days, 7 days, and then they do what? They shouted. That's what God told them to do. Now keep in mind, because I'm going to hit something in a minute that you may never thought of, even though you're familiar with these stories. Keep in mind, God gave them these instructions. God said, march around Jericho once a day, 7 days, 7 times. After that, blow the trumpet and shout. And we know, as a result of it, all the walls came down. So they go and they conquer and they bring this city down. My head just went blank. But after they conclude in this central campaign, and that's the big thing, is you're noticing it's the central campaign, it's the first one, phase 1. After they get rid of Jericho, they come up against Ai. What happens at Ai? They don't just get beat, they get beat back. Now, why did they get beat?
Because they didn't follow God's instructions.
Okay, keep that thought. We know one reason was that some man by the name of Achan, who we'll get to in a minute, he did something that brought about this defeat. But is that the only reason the city of Ai was defeated? Now, when they get down to it, that's the only thing that God says to Joshua about. But to me, I see a difference. We just took Jericho. Now we're going up against the absolute smallest city in the land. I think arrogance may have played a part. Because nowhere, going into Ai, nowhere do they get instruction from God. They decide how many soldiers they're going to send up. They decide how they're going to attack this city. They decide what they're going to do with it. And I thought about it when I caught on to this some time ago, you know, how it's so much like it is today. We cry out, we call, we beg, and we plead God when the big things are taking place. But if it's something small, we don't look to God for nothing. We just go do what we feel we ought to do. Israel said, we'll send 10,000 men. Everybody else get a break. This is going to be nothing. Nothing to beating these people. And they get beat back many, many miles. They were chased down with several of them being put to death. And after they had their arrogance knocked down, then they come to find out about this guy Achan. They don't know who it is to start. But God tells Joshua, somebody touched the accursed thing. Does anybody know what the accursed thing was? There was 3 things, actually. He got caught with a Babylonian robe. He got caught with silver and gold. And God said that was the accursed thing. Now, it was only a curse because he took it. If he'd have left it, Israel would have had it anyway. But it wasn't to go any man's pocket. And so then Joshua sets out. I've got to find out who did this. So they go through the process. They bring it down to Achan. Now, does anybody know what happens to this man?
They stoned him to death.
Not good things.
They stoned him to death.
And
Wasn't it his
burned him,
family,
didn't
wasn't
they?
it his family too that?
yep, exactly. Because of his behavior, he was put to death. His wife was put to death. His whole family was put to death. Actually, anybody that was associated with this man as relative was put to death. Now, Lord, it won't come back. It won't come back to my mind. I was trying to find one real fast in Psalms. I can't remember the name of it now. But in the book of Psalms, and I'll find it one time. But you know how there's always a little statement above the beginning of Psalms about who wrote it, who it's from, and all. Well, there's a lot of them. Well, I'll never find that in the book of Isaiah. There's a lot of them that start out with a song or a psalm or a song. I can't think of the name that they account to the people that wrote them. But the name that they say wrote these songs, oh, I hate it when I do this. And I know the answer just won't come to my mind. But, okay, I'll find one later and explain it to you guys. What happens is the name that is given credit for writing certain songs and psalms were relatives of this man, Achan. But we know that his entire family was put to death. How did any of his relatives, years later, write songs and psalms that we have recorded today, if they were all dead? And they didn't write them beforehand. I think it actually says the sons of Achan or Achor, something of that nature. Now, I'm going to tell you something. I don't take things by blind faith, but I'll entertain thoughts that I can't prove. It is recorded in something called the Chumash. Now, the Chumash is 5 little books. It's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. It's 5 little books, and it's handled. It's actually written in both languages, Hebrew and English. And then there are notes given on every verse of the Chumash, and then there's the Tehillim, which is the book of Psalms. Every chapter, every verse in that. And it's remarks that are made by various rabbis, schools of rabbis, sages, which are very wise men. Some of the men that recorded things that are in the Chumash literally was with Moses. They were wise men with Moses, and they were writing down what certain things meant when it happened. In there, it is recorded that when God opened the ground to swallow up this man's family, and that's what he did with them. This Chumash claims, I wasn't there. And it claims that this is the only reason they're alive in Psalms. That some of the relatives repented. And when the earthquake took place, God established a shelf. And these people that were spared fell on the shelf and was able to get back out of it. I don't know if that's true or not, but I'm not going to doubt whether the guy could have done that or not. I mean, we're talking now about where he just brought down a wall because somebody shouted. A very thick wall, very large wall. But it's, it is interesting, and I'll find one of the Psalms that says it. I should have seen one by now, but I didn't. So when they get to the central campaign, they begin at Jericho, then they go over to Ai, then they have the problem with Achan. But look at the next part, where it says Gerizim and Ebal. Slide over to chapter 8. Because what happens here is something that Moses told him to do, even though he wasn't going to be there. Start at verse 30. Now they've already conquered the central area, the cities that are in the central section. Now they are in a valley, and there's two mountains on sides of the valley. There's Mount Gerizim, there's Mount Ebal. We're going to see that half of the people are standing in front of one of them, half of the people are standing in front of the other. Now watch what it says, 30 through 35. Now Joshua built an altar to the Lord God of Israel in Mount Ebal, as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded the children of Israel. As it is written in the book of the law of Moses, an altar of whole stones, over which no man has wielded an iron tool, and they offered on it burnt offerings to the Lord and sacrificed peace offerings. Verse 32. And there in the presence of the children of Israel, he wrote on the stones a copy of the law which he had written. Could you imagine how long this ordeal took? Because we talk about the law of Moses, there's talking about the first 5 books. Now on this, I don't know if they're just really talking about what happens in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, or all of them. But verse 33, then all Israel with the elders and officers and judges stood on either side of the ark before the priests, the Levites who bore the ark of the covenant of the Lord, the strangers as well as who was born among them. Half of them was in front of Mount Gerizim, half of them was in front of Mount Ebal, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded before, that they should bless the people. And afterward, he read all the words of the law, the blessings and the cursing according to all that is written in the book of the law. There was not a word at all that Moses had commanded, which Joshua did not read before all the assembly, with the women, the little ones, and the strangers who were living among them. Now this is something Moses said back in the book of Deuteronomy, that when you get there, this is what you do. Moses has not been in this land. I've often wondered, how did Moses know they was going to come into the central campaign, and then at the conclusion of the central campaign, they was going to make their way down to a valley that was bordered on both sides by 2 mountains with their name, and Moses had this scene set up before they ever got out of the wilderness. And is this an important thing? It must have been important. Moses announces it, and then on top of it, they come down and do it. Now, when it said that it read the whole law, because of that wording, cursing and blessing, I don't know if that's the only aspect of the law they read. I don't know if they read about the, setting up the tabernacle, all the stuff that they did in the wilderness. I don't know if they talked about the creation. I don't know if they started in Exodus or Deuteronomy. I do know one thing: whatever they read was an encouragement to the people. So then they move. They go from the southern campaign to from the central campaign to the southern campaign, and that's covered in chapters 9 and 10. Let me get a drink. Slide over to chapter 9. I want you to see something. See how our minds are. Do we have anybody tuned in from home? All right, if you're tuned in from home, if you know the answer to this, when I ask the question, you can send it. Just type it into us. All right. This southern campaign starts with something that takes place. In chapter 9, there's a treaty set up with the Gibeonites, who were living in Canaan. They were people that lived there. Now watch this treaty. Look at verse 3 through 6. But when the inhabitants of Gibeon heard what Joshua had done to Jericho and Ai, they worked craftily. They went out and pretended to be ambassadors. And they took old sacks on their donkeys and old wineskins and torn and mended. Old and parched sandals on their feet and old garments for themselves. And all the bread of their provision was dry and moldy. And they went to Joshua, to the camp at Gilgal, and said to him and to the men of Israel, we have come from a far journey. They were living right next door. We had come from a far journey. Now, therefore, make a covenant with us. Now, here's what happens. Israel, because of a ruling that God gave, was to make peace with anybody who wanted peace, as long as they wasn't Canaanites, because they would take that whole entire country. These men come dressed in ways to fool Joshua and the people, and it works. And Joshua makes a treaty with them. You live in our land as long as you want. You stay here as long as you want. We will never bother you. We will never attack you. And he's doing all this swearing by God that we're never going to attack you as long as you're here. We made this peace. This treaty lasts for 430 some years. Does anybody know what happened when it was broken? Well, I'll tell you this. It was broken by King Saul, and it was fixed by King David. Does anybody know what happened? Oh, when I say what I'm about to say, you're going to say, oh, I definitely remember that. And my wife's going to say, oh, I definitely remember that. But I want to give people at home just a second. Something takes place 430 years after this because Saul breaks it. Saul goes and kills some of these people. David becomes king. The leaders of this country come to David and say, we want justification for what Saul did. David said, what do you want? And what did they ask for? And I'll give you some more hint. They said, we want 7 sons associated with Saul. And whose sons did they get? Huh? What did she do?
She's the one that protected the bodies from the...
Yeah, Rizpah. What happened to Rizpah was done because Saul, 400 years after it started, violated this covenant that was made by Joshua and these people. Even though these people tricked Joshua. As a matter of fact, on your little outline thing, you see where I said the wool pulled over. Because that's just what they did. They pulled the wool over on his eyes. And they got away with being allowed to remain, I don't know why my mind keeps slipping, being allowed to remain in their own original place. And the amazing thing to me is how the memory of these people in them days. You know, how people 430 years after this treaty was made remember that this treaty was made. And come back. I mean, in Egypt, when Moses left Egypt the first time, prior to him returning, they say there came a Pharaoh who did not know the sons of Abraham. The sons of Israel, that did not know about the 12 tribes. They didn't know about Joseph. I mean, they forgot him 40 years. And here's people 430 years. They remembered 430 years ago, your leader made a covenant with us, and he swore to God that this would be the covenant forever. And now you broke it because King Saul killed some of our people. And so in return, they take his. Now, I knew both of you was very familiar with Rizpah. That's why I was saying it'll catch on to you in a minute. And you know, I got to see my little outline myself now, see where I'm at. Oh, Ajalon. Look at chapter 10. Here's a second thing that takes place. Now, during all this time, they are conquering the seas. As I said, we're just going to paraphrase these down and look at it. But something amazing takes place here. But when the king of Jerusalem, and actually it would have been called Justice then because it didn't become Jerusalem until David's days. When he had heard that the Gibeonites made an alliance with Israel, he went out and made a pact with 4 other kings and said, we 5 kings together ought to be able to destroy them. And so he sets this all up. And in chapter 10, something takes place. They had this meeting. They had this war. Israel can win the war, but they got a problem. Nighttime's coming. And Joshua calls out to God. In verse 12 of chapter 10, it says, Then Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord delivered up the Amorites before the children of Israel. And he said in the sight of Israel, Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and moon in the valley of Ajalon. So the sun stood still, and the moon stopped, till the people had revenge upon their enemies. Is this not written in the book of Joshua? So the sun stood still in the midst of heaven and did not hasten to go down for about a whole day. Now, I think how this breaks down, and I know it happens again, I can't remember how many minutes. I think as this breaks down, the sun stood still 23 hours and 20 minutes. Yeah, 23 hours and 20 minutes. Now, several years ago, up in Maryland, at the NASA Center, where the scientists all work, they were studying the stars, or whatever they do. And one of the scientists took note and said, hey, something ain't right. And they said, what? They said, we're missing a whole 24 hours of time. Something's wrong. They started checking. They couldn't find it. One of the scientists was a born-again believer. And he said, I know what happened to it. And they said, what? He said, well, in the days of Joshua called for the sun to stand still. It stood still for 23 hours and 20 minutes. And then there's another place in the Bible which says that they called for the sun to stand still, and it stood for guess how long? 40 minutes. And that was never made popular in the church, although many ministers knew it. And I thought when it came out, how can nobody be talking about this? And these were scientists that found this out in the book. As always. And yeah, they proved something we already knew. And this happens, and a lot of people don't realize, and I don't know why they don't understand it, but the Word of God is filled with science. It's a lot to do with science. I don't know why people have a problem with understanding that, but a lot of ministers don't believe or won't believe the fact that science is involved in the Scriptures. Everything's involved in the Scriptures. Mathematics involved, division's involved. Science is involved in the Word of God. It's all there. And this guy proved to them, because once he did it, he got the Bible out. He went to this place, he went to the other place, showed it to them. Now, there was no record that any of them scientists ever gave their heart to the Lord or believed anything other than there was 24 hours of sunlight that shouldn't have been, and we can't explain it. Now, I don't know if you know this, but supposedly, if it's true that they found Jericho, because the Word of God says Jericho cannot be rebuilt. It's a curse to do it. Supposedly, somebody has found it. They've dug down and they've hit the wall of Jericho. They hit the top of it. And they cleaned the good part up. And because of its size, they said, this has got to be Jericho. The problem was, when the Israelites shouted, Jericho did what? Fell down. Well, did it fall over? And a lot of people don't understand that. The Bible never, and I mean, you should look at a lot of your peers, like particularly what they do for the kids. You see all these big boulders and the Israelites jumping over. The Bible never said nothing about the walls falling over. It said they fell down. Now, whoever was this archaeologist group that came upon this, they announced, if this is Jericho, and they're not certain, but they're saying, if this is Jericho, then this city it sunk straight down in the earth. And all Israel's soldiers did was walk across the top of the wall. And again, something being proven. And that was in the 1900s. Well, that's not too long ago. But that was back in the mid-1900s, I think, that they actually discovered this. And my understanding is they were ordered to stop and never touch nothing else around it because the Hebrews were saying that city can't come back. It's just like Noah's Ark. They believe they know where the ark is. Well, an imprint of what's left of the ark. I don't know if you've seen this or not. But the country that it's in won't let nobody else up there, since that one man went up there and found where the size was right, the shape was right, and the markings would have looked just like the wood would have looked, but because it was frozen in time and all, it was all frozen together. And now the people won't let nobody else up there. There's another place. I don't know why I'm giving you all this. There's another place in Africa. And guess what they believe in Africa? The Ark of the Covenant. And here's why. There's a little town or city in Africa. I don't know what country it is. It's just in Africa. Has a little building in it. It was a piece of land that Queen Sheba was over. They claim that when she left Jerusalem, claimed she was pregnant by Solomon, and that he sent the ark with her to her homeland to protect it. They claim to this day, as we're sitting here, that there's a little building there that the ark is in, and there's only 2 people allowed in the building at one time. And once they go in, they can never come out unless they're carried out. Nobody else can go in. And they swear that the Ark of the Covenant is sitting in that room. However, Ethiopia? Yeah, Queen of Sheba, Ethiopia. Is it talk about where the Ark of the Covenant aspect? Is that what you're looking at? All right, so you
in the town of Axum.
yeah, see how fast you can pull that stuff up?
It's in the same area of Zion Cathedral.
Yeah. But there's also another place, another story, that they claim that the Ark of the Covenant is on the east side of the eastern wall. And that's why they won't let Israel get over there. That Solomon had buried it before the temple was destroyed. And some people dug up to a wall, and when they got to a certain place, they were caught. And the people running the country said, you can't go past that wall. And everybody believes that the ark is on the other side of that wall. I don't know where the Ark of the Covenant, I think it's like the book of Moses. The book of Hebrews. I don't know who wrote it. I don't know when it was written. But when I get in the presence of the Father, I'll find out all these things I don't know about. But could you imagine having the ability? Oh, and then, of course, Hitler's stories. He had the Ark. But he never got to it, but they had it before he got killed. Some interesting studies of things like that, science and archaeology. And as we saw, Joyce just pulled it up that fast on the internet, so it's not like it takes a long time. But take note here. We have the sun slows down to a stop. The moon stops. The Israelites become victorious in that aspect of the land. But then in verse 10 and verse 28, chapter 10, so the Lord routed them before Israel, killed them with a great slaughter at Gibeon, chased them along the roads that go to Beth. God, I'm getting dry. Beth Horon, and struck them down as far as Secta and I'm getting twisted, and Mekkedah. In verse 28, we find out all that really happened there. Verse 28. Yeah. On that day, Joshua took Mekkedah and struck it down and its kings with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed them all. He utterly destroyed them, all the people who were in them. He let none remain. He also did to the king of Mekkedah as he had done to the king of Jericho. He killed him. But in this story here, as they're fighting this southern campaign, 5 different kings are cut down by the nation of Israel. Now, something to keep in mind. Yeah, I got plenty of time. Something to keep in mind in all this. And I'm only using this number because it's the only number I've seen. To my understanding, Israel at the start of all this has 40,000 men, soldiers. They got men that are older maybe, but they got 40,000 men. I don't know how many, but you would assume some was killed at Jericho. We know a few was killed at Ai. In these other battles, you would think some would be being put to death. It's war. But yet, the stronger every enemy force gets, the more God destroys them with whatever he's got left of these Israelites. I don't know, they might be under 20,000 men now. But they now don't take just a city. They destroy 5 kings, and they take, well, that's in the northern campaign, but they destroy 5 kings at one time. So now what have we done? We've conquered the central campaign. The center aspect of Canaan is settled, not settled, but conquered. We've conquered the southern part. All that's left is the north. Now you can imagine the thoughts these people living in North Canaan must have had when they realized the Israelites are coming this way. I mean, these people that had just wiped out everything that they had ever known about. And they say now they're coming this way. And we see their story in Joshua chapter 11. Let me find one more place. Yeah, the northern campaign. And it starts out, it came to pass, when Jabin, king of Hazor, heard these things, now watch what he tries to do, that he sent to Joab, king of Madon, to the king of Shunem, and to the king of Ischia. So he's going to do this too. And to the kings who were from the north in the mountains, in the plains south of Chinneris, which is in the northern section, in the lowlands and in the heights of Dor and on the west. He's contacting everybody. Now, your little map doesn't do justice on the location, on just how large this northern section is. But it starts out at the sea and it comes all the way back down to the Sea of Chinnereth. It's large. It's a large area. And he brings all these people in. He organized and led this attack against Israel. And was not only just defeated, but if you read in chapter 11, you find that his capital was burned to the ground, nothing left. They got no capital city now. That's the equivalence of. Have you ever watched Civil War movies? Particularly Civil War movies. And there's always some guy running carrying a flag. Flag represents their unit. The flag represents their whatevers. During the war, it was considered the highest honor to carry that flag. The hope was the flag never touched the ground. Another desire was for the enemy to capture your flag. Because if they took your flag, it was just like taking your whole community. If they took this flag for the state of Tennessee, it was like we beat Tennessee. We got their flag. And that's what they waved proudly. Well, that's what happens with this guy. They took his capital. Now, I don't know if they ran things in the capital there like we run in the capital here, but could you imagine if we lost Washington, D.C. overnight, what this country would be like? Oh, it'd be nuts. And I imagine that Jabin, the king of Hazor, got about just as crazy when he went against them. But then God does something else. And I love this part. Look at verse 6. We'll come to an end in a few moments. But the Lord said to Joshua, do not be afraid because of them. Now remember, he's loaded up. He stacked the odds against Joshua. The Lord said, don't be afraid of them. And again, this is the difference when we follow the Lord's instructions versus trying to do it on our own. He said, do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow about this time I'm going to deliver all of them slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. Verse 9. So Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. Now, what do you think would happen to the horse or a horse that's been hamstrung? What it actually means is they're cut. They're cut back here. Yeah. Well, they were useful for only one thing after this, and that was a farm use. But they were useless to be in war or to have riders or pull chariots. So all these countries, or not countries, all these towns that joined up with Jabin over in Hazor, and all the people that fell in with him, Israel hasn't even gotten to their places yet. But when they do, they've got no horses for war. Because every horse was hamstrung. That's amazing. And that's the history. Next week, we'll look at the distribution of the land. Does anybody have any questions?
I have a bunch that I think I'm going to have to look up when I get home.
That's the best way to learn on them, is to look them up. And do understand, do keep one thing in mind. On some of these things I discussed, like the Kamash and things like that, I don't know that those things are extremely right, but I think those people knew things better than we know, the language and things of that nature. I do know the thing with the sun and the NASA thing. I know that was right. I know it was right about the belief that the ark is in that little building she was talking about in that little town in Ethiopia. I don't know if it's there, but I know the story was right that it's there. And I don't know if it's right that it's on the other side of that wall. Did I say another one? Oh, I don't know if it's right that those sons repented when the ground opened up and they fell down to it and they were left alive.
I mean, it lines up with God's character. I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised that it happened.
That happened, but yeah.
But because God doesn't tell us it happened, but I mean, it amazes me. And every time I read it, and I see one, are we done?